Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Ritchie and I'm really lucky this week to be joined by Dr. Gurnam Singh. Hi Gurnam,
Hiya, Tom.
how you doing?
I'm doing great, yeah. And the sun's shining. What more can we ask for?
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more just about your current role and perhaps your initial interests in AI.
Yeah, Tom. I mean, I've always been interested in kind of technological development and pedagogy, really. That's kind of my field, the kind of sociology of education. Currently, I'm kind of honorary associate professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. I've been here for about 6 years, but I'm a Warwick person anyway. I did my PhD at Warwick many, many years ago. My kind of field of studies is around anti-racism, decoloniality, but also pedagogy. So I've been particularly interested in the kind of the amount of large language models and of course ChatGPT and the kind of implications that has for teaching and learning and knowledge transmission. And I'm really curious about what questions this raises in terms of how we understand human intelligence as well. Yeah.
I wonder if we could start a little bit by a bit more of a general question about your kind of interest and initial thoughts on this kind of coming AI revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, I've kind of always been interested in how technology kind of functions within society to produce social kind of outcomes, really, and inequities. And you can look at that at kind of micro level, kind of in terms of how individuals might interact with technology. But you can also look at that from a kind of sociological base. And I think that we have to, in a sense, have that kind of both lenses. We have to zoom in and zoom out in order to really make sense of some of the kind of bigger ethical questions. But from ancient times, really, I mean, the advent of writing to large language models today, though views might be polarized, I think in truth, technological change has always kind of given something, but also taken something away. It's never kind of neutral. There are always kind of winners and losers, and I think that's kind of where I'm interested in. So if we look at, say, for example, through the lens of coloniality and race, technological innovation has been deployed as a tool for oppression and dominance. So you can't divorce technology, which might be seen as kind of value neutral, as kind of almost not about people's attitudes and people's attitudes. And I think it's looking at the relationship between the two. And I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the way in which technological advancement and technological innovation has been associated with Western civilization, with whiteness. And here I'm also interested in the way in which, particularly if you think about AI and information technologies, the way in which intelligence itself becomes understood, human intelligence, because one of the ways in which racism and Western kind of imperialism functioned was to suggest that those who, the non-white, non-Western, native people were primitive or they were less kind of intelligent, and the whole kind of theories around scientific racism and intelligence. So, in terms of IT, I'm interested as to how some of those tropes do play out within this space. We know that infamously most kind of robots tend to be depicted as white, or if there's a dark robot, it's probably if it's dangerous, it's black. If it's white, it must be pure. And it's interesting how whiteness itself does play out within this space, and that's something else that we can explore a bit more. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up something you said about value neutral technologies because there's lots of discussion around AI that because of the nature of training data and how AI is programmed, it's perhaps not value neutral because obviously you have to program AI with a certain set of data, which, as you have identified, tends to have a Western focus. And you can see how there's an inherent bias almost within some AI systems because if you have a language that's a particular dialect that maybe 150 people speak, the chances are they will not have an AI built for them that considers their experience, their culture. And so I wonder, how do you see bias in AI systems as being something that perpetuating these existing inequalities?
It's quite paradoxical here, Tom, because at one level we see artificial intelligence as being kind of almost value free. The whole notion of AI is that it hasn't got an opinion. It doesn't have, and bias could be seen as a form of having opinion, hidden opinions. Yet on the other hand, at the end of the day, these large language models, particularly if we're looking at those, their own consciousness, if you like, is determined by the kind of language that the words that they kind of absorb. Yeah, and so the bias is in that, but then they can reproduce that within their own systems, and that's the key thing. There's strong evidence that certainly that these large language models are actually exacerbating forms of bias and racism because of the data that they're trained on. There's another interesting almost philosophical thought here as well, and this comes from my work on decoloniality. And it's this idea that we think about the knowledge of humanity, but actually it's only a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of knowledge of humanity that we actually have registered. Whether that's in, say, books or articles, written words. The vast majority of human knowledge has never been recorded because it's oral tradition. It's kind of cultural. So if we think about indigenous peoples across the world, even today, their knowledge is, other than maybe being as it were, appropriated through anthropologists who have then written them up through their own lens. Actually, we don't have access to the vast majority of the world's knowledge. So the danger is that the knowledge that we have at the moment is already partial. It's already filtered through a lens, and a privileged lens at that. And it's that these large language models will be then feeding off. Yeah. So in a sense, we have a huge problem here, and I think that's something for us to think about. I mean, it might well be that will help us to realize the limitations of AI, and therefore having other ways of accessing insight rather than simply fishing in this one space. The other way I think we need to, maybe this conversation would be useful, is to kind of make a distinction between what might be seen as AI, artificial intelligence, and therefore what is real intelligence, what is non-artificial intelligence, what is human intelligence. And again, that's a kind of quite a tricky one. But I think we would agree that AI, in a sense, doesn't have any intelligence. It's simply good at processing data, amazingly good at that. Now, unless you think that, I suppose you could argue that part of intelligence is processing data. I think that might be the case. But, I mean, if we were just processing data as human beings, I don't know what would happen to us. We'd probably get sent to an asylum or something. And of course, AI systems themselves don't just process data randomly. They're fed algorithms, yeah? So in that sense, the human touch is there. The kind of the shadow behind AI is still humanity, and I guess that's where some of the bias would be kind of set up there, in terms of how those algorithms are created, and we can look at examples of that in various fields. Yeah, and if we think about real intelligence, then I think that there's something about consciousness, self-awareness, emotional understanding, creativity. Now, I know that there's a debate around what is creativity and what isn't, but I suppose there's something about a theory of mind. And I think for me, what makes human intelligence human is that we have a theory of mind. In fact, the other thing I was thinking about, Tom, is that humans actually form judgments based on partial data, on actually not huge amounts of data. Yeah. And so I don't know if that means that part of being human is being biased. Yeah. But then there's some kind of way that we can then reflect on that almost immediately. It's a bit like saying I might make a judgment about your appearance, yeah. Now you might feel offended by that and challenge me straight away. For me, there's something human about this exchange, and I'm not sure that AI systems can kind of have that kind of exchange. So in some senses, whilst feeding off large amounts of data may well give better kind of statistical significance, yeah, than kind of us feeding off our own kind of lived experience. I think in some senses it can hide the bias even further, yeah. And I think that's so it's a different kind of challenge. I think challenging AI, bias in AI systems is different to challenging bias amongst human beings. And I think we need to, maybe that's the work that needs to be done. And rather than being, as it were, duped by the kind of technology, the kind of, what was it that Harold Wilson said, the white heat of technology, I think it was, yeah, and we can be quickly kind of drawn into that. If we think about the whole kind of way in which, say, black young men in London are, I mean, during the COVID, they were 9 times more likely to be kind of prosecuted for breaking the rules. Now, is that because they're 9 times more likely to break the rules, or is it because they're much more subject to surveillance? Yeah, and I think that's the kind of key issue around law enforcement, is that AI tools can, massively, exponentially increase the power of surveillance. And if you've already got an inbuilt kind of bias, if you've already got, say, for example, data in there that suggests 17-year-old single parents pushing a pram in a supermarket are more likely to be shoplifters, then you know where the cameras are going to go. I mean, there was this recent the Home Office was using algorithms to sort out visa applications. And again, it actually it was found that it was sifting out particular groups. Eastern Europeans were being targeted because this whole stereotype that if you come from Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, then you're kind of going to be a bogus traveller here. So there's all these other kind of interesting ways in which some of the kind of geopolitics becomes reproduced. Yeah, the kind of ideas around who can and who's dangerous, who isn't dangerous, who should be in and who shouldn't be.
I think it's a really interesting point. You've touched on lots of things there. I really liked your point about bias being an inherent part of the human condition, because we do all employ bias, and we do employ stereotyping as a survival mechanism, and stereotyping there in not the perhaps way that we're talking about it in the sense of social justice, but we make decisions based on, as you say, very, very limited information. I really like the point you said as well of this idea that AI, is it our reflection? And if it is our reflection, it provokes us to think more about consciousness. It provokes us to think more about what do we understand, what it means to be human. It leads me to the question, I suppose, of how can we avoid repeating the mistakes of past technologies when it comes to using and employing AI?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Of course, it's an interesting question to ask AI that question, and I love doing these experiments where you actually ask it, and what give me some hope, because actually, if AI has the potential to reproduce inequities or reproduce bias, then in some senses we can harness the same power to do the opposite. Yeah, and so that might be about how we construct algorithms. It might be about how we train people to use AI systems. But it's also got to be about the way in which, when AI systems give you something, how do they give you that? Yeah. And if you look at some of, even when ChatGPT first came in, it was giving you all kinds of rubbish without really being self-critical. But nowadays, I think there's a kind of almost an ethic kind of a reflexivity being built into those systems. So it will say something like, well, this is what I would suggest based on this data, but you need to be careful because of X, Y, and Z. Yeah. So I think that's good. I think it can play that kind of educative role. It's almost saying it's a bit like us saying, I understand my limitations, therefore don't take everything that I say for granted, which is kind of what our education's about, isn't it? It's about enabling people to think critically all the time. So I always say that we even greater emphasis on critical thinking is important. But let's think about some of the kind of I think it requires a multifaceted approach. I think something around data itself, as I was saying, if you have partial data going into a system, or you have biased data, then that's going to reproduce those same biases or make them even worse, obscure those biases. So I think that ensuring that training data sets are representative of different groups, that can help to reduce bias. Yeah, so more diverse data sets, including collecting data from a wide range of sources, for example, particularly underrepresented groups. Yeah. So I think that's something to think about, and that's going to be more obviously a concern to those people who are inputting that data. Obviously, it's not easy because some of these AI systems just kind of they're just farming, they're just kind of swallowing whatever's out there. So I guess that means when we put data out there, that we need to be wary about how that might be misconstrued. But most of all, I think this notion of accountability and transparency. At the end of the day, these AI tools are just other tools, and the danger is that we see them as a kind of panacea, as replacing human intelligence. Yeah, we have to see them as companions. Maybe calculators are useful for human beings, but they're not going to sort out your overdraft. You've got to think about that. As I say, I don't think we can ever get rid of bias, but we can find ways of mitigating that. We can build structures around it. I mean, in a sense, it's a bit like you go on the roads. I mean, most of us, if we're safe drivers, shouldn't need to be told, here's a kind of 30 miles limit. We should naturally have that sense, but we do have them, and that mitigates our own kind of. So I think that we need those kind of traffic light systems. We need those red lights and green lights and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And of course, auditing is really important. So I think that there's, in a sense, there's no solution, but I think that, in life, it's always about engaging and improving, really. But I don't think there's a kind of end point there. And of course, as you were saying, maybe there is no notion of non-bias. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what a non-bias existence would be. I mean, we lose our humanity if we're not biased, I guess, even though bias is, can be, really problematic as well.
Bias obviously is such a loaded word. We all have an understanding of what we take bias to mean. But I think what's really interesting from these podcasts is we always tend to start straying back towards philosophical discussions, whether we intend to or not. And we've already spoken about consciousness and humanity and what do these things mean. And perhaps there is one of those discussions to be had around the concept of bias, and actually that it does have a place in very, very specific contexts in what it means to be human. You mentioned about the red lights and green lights, and it made me think a little bit more about almost AI. Is it a case of training AI to provide almost enabling constraints that train us, if you see what I'm saying? If it trains us away from bias, if AI can have access to all knowledge, whatever we take that to mean, and I take your point about oral tradition is almost completely forgotten about in this discussion.
Yeah, yeah.
That there's a thought there about, can AI be used as a useful tool? If you could, you think about this human AI kind of hybridity, is that perhaps the right
Mm-hmm.
word? And there's huge kind of social and cultural implications that come from that hybridity. But I wonder, do you have any thoughts about how that could come to redefine?
I mean, I'll tell you, I think I know what you're getting at. It's a slightly philosophical question, but I think one of the things I've thought about is, if we're using artificial intelligence, then we have to recognize there is non-artificial intelligence, yeah, and that, again, back to where that's what makes us human. And then we have to define, well, what is that non-artificial intelligence, and then how do we ensure that that doesn't get lost, yeah. And one of the things I've been arguing about is that AI is essentially about information that then is presented as knowledge. Okay. But I think that non-artificial intelligence or human intelligence is about knowledge that manifests as wisdom. If that makes sense, yeah? And so maybe we need to, and if we, into knowledge and wisdom, I suppose ethics and reflexivity and all those kind of things come in there. And so I don't think that AI can take our ethical responsibility. I mean, that would be disastrous if we handed over decision making, because that's a kind of nightmare scenario. So we need to avoid that. Just like, I mean, it's a bit like the kind of driverless cars, The problem is the car can never be ethically responsible. And that's the big stumbling block now in driverless cars. And so I think that we need to even think more about what it is to be human in that space. But in terms of social justice, I mean, I actually think one of the things I've been thinking about is one of the ways in which education inequity functions is that those people who are privileged have much more access to uh, social capital and cultural capital by virtue of either that they live a privileged lifestyle or that they often will have parents or relatives and friends, networks who have an abundance of social and cultural capital. Yeah. And so I was thinking that AI may well be able to offer some more equity there. Yeah. For example, if we think about ChatGPT and these tools that write essays or write really nice letters or emails, yeah. I mean, in some senses, these are skills. I'm not sure that this is necessarily intelligence, but they are skills that you can learn. They are tropes. They are, and this may well be somewhere where students who have got ideas, who maybe English isn't their first language, international students, maybe students who don't come from a background where you've got lots of literary kind of tradition. who struggle to write or to express themselves, come from oral kind of background. Here's a beautiful, wonderful, opportunity for you to have your ideas, as it were, packaged in ways that you can, communicate them. So I think there's a very interesting debate around, whether this is an equalizer, and I think that's interesting in itself. This whole area around medicine, I think, and access to healthcare. I mean, to be honest, I do find a nuisance having to speak to the doctor on the phone. And I suspect we're not far away from some kind of chatbots and things like that. But I guess if you can get that done well, then that could open up access to a whole lot of other people that they wouldn't otherwise. Yeah. I think amplifying marginalized voices as well. I think that's another one. You can use actually AI tools to analyze large amounts of data, and that in itself can help to expose the kind of biases that might be out there, and that could empower people who are making these arguments anyway. So in the sense that you could turn it on itself, yeah, you could use it for that, and to do that. And I mean, activism, I think that's another area which, although the problem with in the way in which you can use AI tools for visualizing data, for example, or for developing new resources and media, particularly, as you will know that media, producing good media is very expensive. But I think some of these AI tools, for example, you can publish a book. You can use an AI tool to almost publish a book with raw material. Now, some people might think that's cheating, but for others, that might be opening up access for them to be able to have a voice. Yeah. So I think there are kind of some possible applications for social justice there. In some senses, it's how we can creatively deploy this that really is the challenge.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'm really glad we've come back around to the kind of almost positive elements. I find in a lot of these discussions, we tend to lean more towards the dystopian concepts of AI. But I think what you said there is really important about how AI can be creatively used. But I think the key thing behind what you're saying is that has to be very intentional. People can't expect for AI to just develop in this way, be used in this way. It has to be intentionally used as a tool in the way that we would use other tools. I think you're correct. There are challenges with that of AI seems to be developing so quickly, and you all know this as well as I, that the way that governance works, particularly in large institutions, is by the time something gets through the governance systems, the AI has completely changed or redeveloped into a new space. And so the moment you have a set of guides and rules and regulations, it can be very challenging for those to be current. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean that was just that's it's a really important point, and that kind of comes back to this question. And my work on decolonization really does address this question: whose knowledge? What is good knowledge? What is bad knowledge? Who says that? I don't know. The Encyclopedia Britannica is the authoritative source for knowledge, and say Wikipedia is not. Yeah, who determines that? Because one argument could be that if we were able to develop some kind of protocols around rubbish and non-rubbish knowledge, then you could create algorithms for them to be able to sift out. So do we want a system that is highly regulated, or do we want a system that is totally unregulated? Do we want to be with Elon Musk? Or I don't know, do we want to be with some of the kind of European kind of governments that are concerned about kind of propaganda being put out there? It's a tricky one.
More of a stewardship role than an ownership role is what I was thinking as you were talking. What's come through the conversation today, and hopefully for students to take away, is that particularly in relation to social justice, is that we have to be very conscious in how we use and apply AI on this, because it's so nuanced. It's not as simple as, oh, well, if you fix the training data, then AI is for the good, because there's still challenges that come up with what fixing the training data means. And I guess just last thing, do you have any kind of final thoughts or things that you'd like to share, and then we will bring the podcast to a close?
I mean, what I would say is that writing isn't easy. I mean, even if you read about writers, they say it's really hard. Writing's a hard task, but the hard task, in some senses, isn't the mechanics of the writing. It's the thinking about what you're writing. It's what goes into it. And I think that what I would say to students is, don't be duped by the false economy of these tools that somehow can give you a poem, give you, an essay. It may well give you that, but you might lose something of what you've got yourself. So don't become a hostage to that. But certainly you use it just like we used to use dictionaries. I mean, we all use dictionaries. We use thesauruses. We use other people. I mean, I used to copy other people's writing styles, the particular authors that I liked. So I think we have, maybe there are questions around rethinking what is plagiarism, what isn't plagiarism, and how we would make the distinction between the two. Because it seems to me that all words are plagiarized anyway. But I think that we do need to teach students a lot more about how we can engage. It's a kind of post-human world. I think we are in this post-human world where we can't live without these things. I mean, we can't uninvent the calculator. We can't uninvent ChatGPT. We have to go with them and learn how to ride them. It's a bit like the tiger. We have to learn how to ride the tiger.
Absolutely. As you were talking, I thought of the Mark Twain quote of, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. And I love that as an idea to get students to think about, particularly your point on the false economy. I really like that. I think that's something for students to take away and consider when thinking about the role of AI in helping them with assignments. Is actually, okay, this can help you at this point, but what are you losing in the long term by not engaging perhaps with the thought processes that are required to get to that point yourself? Gurnam, thank you so much for today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I just want to say thank you for being really generous and open as well. It's really great to speak to you, and look forward to speaking again another time.
Yep. Thank you, Tom, and good luck with the module.
Thank you. Thank you so much.